Well, hello my friends, hope you are well. I've just finished moving houses, which is always a massive pain in the butthole, so I wanted to give myself a fun little project to get me back into my hobbying groove. This happy little scene is what I came up with, and this is how I did it.
Swamp Rip Miniatures.
So a while ago, I'd made a small scene of an unfortunate orc getting his brains blasted all over the place by a Cadian soldier, and I had so much fun making this that I thought a project of similar scope would be the perfect way to settle back into my miniature escapades. And this time, it felt only fair to let the orcs get some revenge, so I concocted a plan in my head of a sneaky purple orc ambushing a Catachan jungle fighter. I wanted to have the orc leaping from his hiding place and burying his axe into the Catachan, so my first task was readjusting his legs to be kind of tucked up underneath him as if he was flying through the air, which I did by just chopping up the existing legs and repositioning the pieces with some super glue. After that, I trimmed out some of the join between the legs and the gut so I could position the torso a bit more naturally with the pose I had in mind, and then stuck his little bonds on, kind of facing downward to where his enemy will be. The arms also needed some adjustment to line up with the chopping motion I had planned, so after removing, tweaking and re-weaponizing his right hand, I reattached it onto the arm, this time in a much more downward facing angle. The left arm, on the other hand, didn't need any major adjustments though. I was able to line up the hand with the previous one on the axe to show he's really putting some effort into his chopping, although I did have to glue the shoulder on at a slightly strange angle to allow this. I was now relatively happy with the pose of the miniature, but similar to the left shoulder, there were a bunch of gaps around the limbs where I chopped up and repositioned them. To fix this, I just mixed together a 50-50 blend of green stuff and milliput, since this is the superior sculpting medium, and then used my tools to match up the textures as best as I could. This did mean that our orc ended up with some pretty chunky shoulders amongst some other details, but it's fine because in the headcanon he's been hard on the creatine recently. Now, on to the unlucky soldier. The Catachan was a lot more of a simple build. I didn't really do any adjustments for the individual limbs on this guy. The only major change was to introduce my Dremel into the mix, which I used to cut through the collarbone area to give a nice gory gash that would line up with the orc's axe later on. I glued on his head in a kind of upward facing scream to show that he's shouting out in agony or singing along to the new Shakira album, and then attached his left arm in a bit of an angle off the wounded section, using a bit more greeny put to fill in that gap and give him his very own armpit. In the Orc Brainbuster video I mentioned a moment ago, I found a really good way of creating miniature chunks of gore was to use the Dremel on the sprue and create these little melted plastic nodules of frass. These look really gory when painted up, so I did the same for this guy and glued on a bunch of smaller pieces around the wound so I could give the impression of the axe kicking out a splash of blood on impact. Now here's both the finished miniatures assembled, and I think the poses should line up quite well with each other. For me, it's always worth doing a bit of extra work to reposition and reshape the individual pieces for builds like this, as it's rare to find poses straight out the box that actually work for what you have in mind. And before we start painting them up, I thought I'd quickly whip out the base for them to stand on. I wanted to keep the base for this scene quite small, since the whole aim of this build was to get me back into my groove with a relatively easy project. So I made a start by gluing on a bunch of offcuts of XPS foam onto this 60mm Citadel base. I like to add this extra elevation for builds that I'm planning to have as display pieces, as I think this adds a bit more of a dramatic effect to the overall appearance and looks a lot better than the minis just standing on a flat rim base. So once I've trimmed off the excess, I also bit up a raised section on the rear edge to start adding some visual interest. I'm doing the same thing with this section as well, just gluing bits of foam down and then trimming them off into a more natural shape. Then when I've got a little slope going, I use some offcuts of cork sheeting to start layering up a rocky texture. It's always worth saving your offcuts of foam and cork and whatever else you have for small projects like this, as the cost can add up quite quickly if you're eating into your larger pieces every time you do a build, so definitely collect up all your little scraps when you finish projects and you'll save yourself a bit of money that can be put towards something sensible, like your pension. Well, obviously not, you're going to use it to buy more miniatures. Now, I don't want the gaps and ugly texture sticking through, so I apply a couple of coats of wall filler to the foam, allowing each one to dry fully before adding the next. After sanding it down, we're left with this, which is not perfect, but is now way smoother and will look a lot more professional once it's all painted. To finish this section of the base building off, I'll give it a good slopping with my homemade mud mixture for added durability and texture, you all know the drill by now, and I also scatter on some of this base in mixture with sand and fine gravel, sealing it all in with some watered down PVA glue. This will give me a much more interesting rocky jungle floor texture later, but for now, I set that aside to dry and got to work on painting our miniatures. The Kata-chan was first on my painting hit list, and it's worth pointing out that I primed both of the miniatures in black, as it means that any tricky, hard to reach spots on the recessed areas will just look like shadows if I don't manage to get my brush in there. Again, just a little trick to make the process easier on myself for this build. And I'm going for a really traditional paint job for this guy, just the usual green colours on the pieces of clothing with a nice red bandana, but I did give the trousers a bit more attention, giving them a cool little camouflage effect using some brown and black colours on top of the green. I'd painted some of these guys a little while ago when I did my Kata-chan Jungle Patrol diorama, and at the time I was moaning a bit about finding the flesh awkward to paint, but I actually had so much fun with this guy. I think part of that's because I could give my full attention to one mini instead of batch painting 5 at the same time, but also because I didn't use a wash on the skin. I just layered up different amounts of Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, which gave me a much cleaner and crisper paint job overall. I still think washes are great for certain things, but they're not always the time-saving tool they're supposed to be, you know. I was able to get a way better finish here without them for no real time difference. Once the flesh was done, I just went around doing all the usual little highlights and touch-ups and painting in any details I've missed. Just trying to elevate the paint job a little bit, but still not doing anything especially technical or fancy. Sometimes when I make a video, I'm worried about people telling me my paint job looks shit, because a lot of the time they are a bit rough around the edges, to be honest, but I was really enjoying how this guy was looking this time. He was just looking quite nice and quite crisp overall. For the little gory area, I painted the splashes in with some red first and then used some glistening blood effect paint to give a nice glossy wet blood finish, like it's all fresh and flowing. And with that, our little army guy was finished. Onto the Ork. And the Ork was not so much of a smooth and enjoyable paint job as the Kata-chan, to be fair. I knew that I wanted him to be purple, as purple orcs are sneaky orcs, and who better to launch an ambush than a sneaky orc. But other than the purple flesh, I didn't really have a clear colour scheme in mind for him when I started painting. This meant that I ended up doing a bunch of back and forth with different colours on the clothing pieces. I think I repainted the vest thing on the torso like 3 different times, and probably the same for a bunch of the straps on the arms and legs, so in the end I just settled for some dark neutral colours, hoping that the flesh would be the main star of the show. And then, even for the flesh, for some reason, I decided to experiment with a really dark pink base coat, which I thought would look cool under the purple layers, but I wasn't really feeling it in the end. It just looked a bit messy and probably wasn't as well thought out as it should have been, so I used some Leviathan purple contrast paint to cover up that screamer pink colour, and also mixed in the pink with the purple layer colours I'd been using previously, giving me a much nicer highlight colour than the other ones that looked a bit washed out. So yeah, I think the dark pink base coat could look good, but it would have needed a much greater time investment to blend it all together nicely. And I wasn't really wanting to sink that much time into this piece, but I'm adding it to my list of things to play around with in the future. After that whole debacle, it was then just a case of adding some highlights again and trying to make everything pop a bit more. And as I was coming to the end of the Ork's paint job, I was liking him, but definitely felt that he wasn't matching the finish of the Kata-chan. I mean, it wasn't bad, or at least not awful, I think. You know, he just wasn't as good as I wanted him to be. So I started forming a bit of an idea of how I could mitigate that and add a bit more pizzazz. But we'll come on to that later, although you've definitely seen the thumbnail and can probably already tell what I did, so... Anyway, yeah, a bit of a mixed bag with a miniature painting, but I was still feeling positive about this build as a whole, so time to turn our attention back to the base. I got this kicked off by base coating the rim with a mixture of PVA glue and black paint, and the rocky surface with some burnt sienna and PVA, helping to contain any dusty particles from the filler or basing mixture. I then used an ochre colour on the ground to lighten up the sienna base coat, and while it was still wet, I came in with a variety of greys and browns to build up a more varied look, with the wet paint allowing me to get some really easy blends going between the colours. Once they'd all dried off, I gave the rocks a quick dry brush with some pale grey and the ground with some more light ochre colour, just picking out some of the most raised points to add a bit of definition. Then I used a couple of different green and brown washes to start adding in some more colour variation. And remember earlier where I said I still like washes but they're not always the right tool for the job? For stuff like this, they very much are the right tool for the job, allowing you to easily build up some nice coloured hues across the different textures. Next, I used a brush to add some more deliberately placed highlights, trying not to go too over the top with these, and did the same with some greens to start adding in some of that kind of micro plant life you'd expect to see in a naturey scene like this. After a very final light dry brushing with a sandy colour to add a little more definition, the base was finished and the paint job was looking pretty good overall. I felt like I'd redeemed myself from the Orc paint shambles a moment ago, and although the majority of it ended up being covered by the plant life I'm about to add, it's still worth investing a bit of time into this stage, as you never know which areas are going to poke through. At this point, I stuck our Catachan fighter into position on the base, did a quick bit of surgery on the shaft of the axe, which I'd broken after dropping the Orc onto my floor, whoops, and then started adding all the plants. Much like the Orc, I didn't really have a plan for this step, but thankfully it went a lot better than that paint job did, as I just focused on building up quite a dense amount of vegetation, like I did in the Catachan Jungle Patrol build. Go and watch that if you haven't already. As I think this density of foliage is important for selling a jungle effect. For forest scenes or other generic kind of green naturey builds, you can get away with a bit more sparse vegetation and still get a good finished look. But if you really want a kind of true representation of a jungle, it's really important to build up a solid base layer of foliage first, using a whole variety of different tufts and clump foliages and whatever else you have access to, and then come in with some big leafy plants also. I mainly use gamer grass laser cut plants for this, but there's a bunch of different brands, and I find that they really take the jungle look to the next level once they're in. I had a few little flower tufts for some extra bursts of colour, and it was looking pretty good, so I can now enact my plan for improving the Orc. And my plan for this, again as you would have seen from the thumbnail, was to add a kind of half ghillie suit to his back, as I felt like this would fit with the stealthy vibe of the purple Orcs and give the impression that he'd been laying in wait amongst the undergrowth, ready to pounce on anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. So for this, I just used the same kind of tufts and foliage and whatnot that I'd been using for the basing, with the tiny leaves of this shrubbery stuff being my favourite, as it helps to blend all the other elements together and just looks really cool. I tried to get a good variety of plants going on to sell the effect, and I finished it off with one little purple flower tuft to complement his flesh tone. I thought it was best to not go too crazy with this, so once I had a good clump of greenery built up, I lined him up with the base and saw that the top section now looks a bit too barren. Kinda looked like the Orc was appearing from nowhere, so I added a bunch more larger tufts and leafy plants around this section, leaving a bit of a gap between them to suggest he's jumping through. And with that, the build was finito, so let's see how it came out. So my friends, all in all, this might genuinely be the most fun I've had making a build like this, and I feel like I say this at the end of basically every video I do, but I really am just having more and more fun each time I make something, which is a very good sign. Sure, the Orc paint job was a bit iffy, but it was really rewarding finding a creative way to mitigate that, and I think it ended up adding an extra dynamic to the build, as I planned to just have the plain purple Orc jumping through the air originally, which would have looked okay, but the addition of the Orky ghillie suit looked way better and actually makes a lot of sense too. You might also notice that I added some extra little leaves sprouting from the Orc off camera, as I felt like they'd sell the makeshift jungle ghillie suit effect a bit more, in the same way the leafy plants enhance the jungle effect on the base. So yeah, super fun build to get me back into the flow of things after moving house, and I'm really happy with how this came out overall. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment. Let me know down below how you would improve this for next time, and let me know if you would rather have the wings of a crow for 2 hours a day or the tongue of a gecko for 10 hours a week. But for now, as always, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.